In this video, I'd like to discuss the fourth question from the AP United States Government and Politics second set of questions from 2023, the free response questions. Question 4 asks, an important feature of a democratic republic is that it represents the will of the people. Take a position on whether constitutional checks and balances or citizen participation in social movements is more effective in ensuring the people was represented. And so I'll talk about a support and an opposing view from each of these documents. But first, let's go over what has to be included in this. Use at least one piece of evidence from one of the following constitutional documents. Not constitutional documents. Use at least one piece of evidence from one of the following foundational documents. And these are the same documents which are included in, well, this was a 2023 question. These are the same documents that are included in the 2023 to 2024 and on rework of the curricula. We have Article 1 of the United States Constitution, the Federalist 10, and Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. In your response, you should do the following. Respond to the prompt with a defensible claim or thesis that establishes a line of reasoning. Support your claim with at least two pieces of specific and relevant evidence. One piece of evidence must come from one of the foundational documents listed above. A second piece of evidence can come from any other foundational document not used as your first piece of evidence, or may be from your knowledge of course concepts. Use reasoning to explain why your evidence supports your claim or thesis. Respond to an opposing or alternative perspective using refutation, concession, or rebuttal. So what I wanted to talk about here is we're going to look at each of these three documents until is supporting and opposing views, so you know where to start here. So first, we're looking at Article 1 of the United States Constitution. Basically lays out how the Congress is to work and act. So, important feature of the Democratic Republic that represents the will of the people. So something that represents the will of the people, and this is whether constitutional checks. So constitutional checks and balances. Well, you can talk about anything pretty much in Article 1 that explains the power of the House of Representatives and such, and how they get power to elect certain leaders, or the people get power, or actually this is more of the inner workings of the government. So the constitutional checks, what powers the Congress has given to them, which they are to infringe on, like states' rights and such. So it's more like the inner workings. You could use pretty much anything in that area. Or citizen participation in social movements. Well, you couldn't really use the part is the social movements. I guess if you could classify social movement as a certain election, you could talk about the citizen participation directly electing these representatives, but really that would be for the constitutional checks. Now we have the Federalist 10, which is the argument of faction that could harm the country. So you could see the constitutional checks, well, is that more affecting the will of the people? Could be argued that the minority, there could be too much power of the majority faction over the minority. So, that's something you could discuss for there. Or citizen participation in social movements. Looking at the Federalist 10, you could argue about, I guess the citizens who are electing these representatives, or citizens who are dividing themselves into these factions. There's making that movement to make this larger faction, I guess, is helping to effectively represents the people's will, or a large amount of the population's will, to get specific policy items done. Well, that's not explicitly said in the letter. That's something you can take away from it, and you can go in that direction. Now we have letter from a Birmingham jail. For that, you could do constitutional checks. This is interesting. This would be Federalist 10. You could kind of go either way, but letter from a Birmingham jail is more towards the citizen participation social movements. Pretty much there you could talk about, Martin Luther King Jr. going into, well, he writes this from, I believe, Alabama, and talking about all the protests and things he did there, that social movement in Alabama to help improve the life for African Americans there. And so you could talk about that for citizen participation or something like that from the letter. But for constitutional checks, it's interesting. What could you do from letter from a Birmingham jail to represent constitutional checks? Maybe something could be surrounding what it's there for, or you know, there is stuff about. The thing is, it has to relate to the Constitution, and the checks and balances of it, and I guess it could be like trying to get these free elections. It does speak of the runoff, which is something which does take some voting power away from people. It's interesting. A check and balance. I guess people. You know, this is much more. I don't know if you really use this. You really use it for the citizen participation in the social movement, but for constitutional checks and balances, yeah, You could say that. You could say. I guess, you know, the freedom of religion in the country. Between the government taking out, that's not really checks and balances. Religion playing a role in ensuring equal protection for all. Another minute. You could go somewhere in that area. It's maybe not the strongest argument. So if you already use that document because you really do believe citizens' participation in social movements is more represents the will of the people more, then you'd use the letter from a Birmingham jail for this essay argument.